Hello everyone, my name is Ben Campkin and I'm very pleased to welcome you all, everyone in the room and everyone online to this event and to introduce this event in our Queering Urbanism series, which is organised by the Bartlett's Be Queer network, which is a network of staff and students. So I'm a Professor of Urbanism at UCL and linked to the UCL Urban Laboratory, and I'm really pleased that we can all be here wherever we are today at this third event in our series on queering urbanism, which was an initiative that a group of us put forward in our faculty to bring together LGBTQIA+ staff, students and allies. And we've been supported in this event by our faculty and also by the Development Planning Unit, which is where those of us who are in the room in London are based right now, through the Social Diversity Cluster at the Development Planning Unit, and also by our colleague Alma Daskalaki, who's in the room with us, supporting us, and is doing so with not much notice, so we're very grateful to Alma. So I'd really like to introduce my collaborators in this series, first of all. So Jordana Ramalho is a lecturer in the Development Planning Unit in Diversity Planning, and Say Mali, who's a PhD student who's researching queer practices of placemaking in the Bartlett School of Architecture. So we've been running these events to try and bring together a community around questions of queer urbanism, and our intention is to draw connections between queer and trans studies, and urban practice, as well as activism. Our aim is to provide a space for sustained discussion of queer inclusive urbanisms that bring forward speakers and evidence from a variety of different contexts. We're interested in exploring how theoretical and methodological invention from queer and trans studies and activism inform or could inform urban studies and urbanism. There's of course a long history of urban geographies of sexuality and traditions of scholar activism on issues around queer space, going right back to the 1960s. But today, mediated by technology, there's also a resurgence of interest in queer space and place, and also a globalized queer activism, even though we recognize that queer subjectivities are diverse and the terms in use are varied and context specific, and also at the moment subject to decolonial scrutiny. So we very much want to address these kinds of complexities in the series, and we're excited to be able to learn from our guest speakers today, Professor Amin Ghaziani and Professor Matt Brim, who's joining us online. So Amin and Matt have pointed to a renaissance in queer methods, and so we're really excited to bring them into the series to focus particularly today on queer methods. Before I introduce them further, I just wanted to explain the format for today. This is our first hybrid event, so if it seems awkward, then, or if I seem awkward, I should say, then that's why. But we're pleased to be able to do it. I hope it's working okay for everyone at home on the laptops. So we're going to have two talks, and together those will last around 30 to 45 minutes, and then we're going to have a session, a Q&A session. The event's being recorded and will be shared with attendees. And we encourage you to put questions if you're on Zoom, use the Q&A function. And also when we get to that stage of the event, if you want to raise your hand to ask the question directly, to be unmuted, then you can. So I'd like to introduce our speakers. So Amin Ghaziani is Professor of Sociology and Canada Research Chair in Urban Sexualities at the University of British Columbia. Amin has developed a really rich body of work which examines changing constructs of sexuality through a range of cultural, political, and spatial expressions. He has a wealth of publications that connect sociology, sexuality, and cultural studies. These include book-length studies of lesbian and gay social movements, a volume looking globally at cultures of sexuality, and anthologies on the impacts of HIV antiretroviral therapies, and also on cultural values, questions of cultural value. Amongst his monographs, I want to flag There Goes Gaybourhood, of 2014, which was a really major contribution to the trajectory of scholarly work on the different qualities and models of change in gaybourhoods, as well as the concept of gaybourhoods and their alleged disappearance, which is something that very connects directly with lots of people and work in London, in the London context, I think. So in relation to the transdisciplinary intentions of our series, I also want to note that in his academic practice, Amin places great value on accessible engagement beyond the academy and has been a leading public commentator on issues of sexuality. So Amin's kindly agreed, as he's in London, to be here with us today to talk about his latest book with his co-editor, Matt Brim. And Matt is Professor of Queer Studies at the College of Staten Island and Graduate Center, City University of New York. And together they edited a special issue of Women's Studies Quarterly on queer methods, published in 2016, and more recently, a book on queer methods from 2019, Imagining Queer Methods. And we're, many of us already reading from that and excited to hear more about it and to talk with them about it, which is, you know, an amazing resource, I think, for many people and points to this renaissance, as they've said, of queer methods in many different disciplines. So Matt has also developed an impressive body of work, which is wide-ranging and interdisciplinary, and his most recent book, Poor Queer Studies, Confronting Elitism in the University of 2020, reorients the field of queer studies away from exclusionary institutions of higher education and towards working class colleges, students, theories, and pedagogies. He's a specialist in the work of James Baldwin, and his work includes a pedagogic focus on communicating queer activist histories and on the queering of higher education, including co-edited collections forthcoming on queer sharing in the marketized university and queer precarities in and out of higher education, which both sound amazing. So we're really delighted to warmly welcome you both to UCL and to the Bartlett, and for you to be with us, Matt, online, and Amin with us in person. So really pleased to hand over to you at this point.
Good afternoon. Nice to see all your faces in person and nice to imagine your faces online. As Ben mentioned in his introductory comments, queer studies is in the midst of a methodological renaissance. In both the humanities and the social sciences, scholars have begun to identify a set of practices and procedures that have largely been overshadowed by dramatic advances in queer theory. The 2010 volume, Queer Methods and Methodologies, edited by Nash and Brown, indexed this shift toward methods by reframing the well-rehearsed question, what is queer theory, to the new and emergent, how do we do queer theory? Matt and I first entered this conversation in 2016 with the publication of a special issue of the journal Women's Studies Quarterly, and then we deepened our investments in this conversation in 2019 with the publication of Imagining Queer Methods that NYU published, and that's what you see on this slide. Our two volumes present pioneering and multidisciplinary contributions from sociology, performance studies, African and African American studies, lesbian cultural studies, psychology, statistics, trans and queer studies, media studies, history, and English. With today's event, we take another step forward by being in conversation with the Faculty of Architecture at UCL. And before I proceed at this point, allow me, if you will, to express my sincere gratitude to Ben, Jordana, for the invitation to be here with you today and for organizing this important conversation. Thank you. Trying to advance the slide. There we go. The apparent incommensurability of the phrase queer methods is likely not lost on you. Might the introduction of queer to method provoke anxieties about scientific reliability? Or what about the other way around? Might attaching method to queer neutralize queer's resistive potential? As these questions show, trepidations abound on both sides. I'm a sociologist, and in the social sciences, one of the hurdles that we face for developing queer methods is what we might call physics envy. To establish our legitimacy, sociologists, economists, and political scientists mimic the so-called real or natural sciences by using words like theory, or experiments, or hypotheses, or laws. Science has a method, we say, and to be scientific, we must adopt it. The scientific method proceeds from a theory from which researchers deduce one or more hypotheses as propositions. We then systematically collect our data to test those propositions. We then systematically analyze that data, and depending on the results, it will either confirm or refute that theory. Notice the emphasis and repetition of the word systematic, like systematically collected, systematically analyzed. We're championing the orderly in terms of our pursuit. This method is called hypothetico-deductivism, basically deductively testing hypotheses, so hypothetico-deductivism. In the New York Times, a duo of political scientists, Kevin Clark and David Primo, argued that this approach ignores everything messy and everything chaotic about scientific inquiry. Queer theory, however, couldn't be more different. It celebrates the mess without seeking to clean it up in any way. That word, mess, messiness, wonkiness, is one that many scholars have used, including Sarah Emmett, Heather Love, Catherine Nash and Kath Brown, Michael Werner, John Law, Kevin Clark, and David Primo. Matt and I use it as well in both of our volumes. The pairing of queer and method raises some intriguing thoughts about this mess. Heather Love offers a great discussion about this in our book in the 2019 volume. This is what she says. For those trained in traditional empirical methods, adding the volatile queer to method introduces the scandal of aesthetics and cultural studies, jargon, small sample sizes, in some cases a single, often fictional text, unclear standards of evidence, lack of attention to representativeness, and disconnection from real people, places, and things. For those trained in the humanities, Love continues, the scandal is the opposite. Anchoring queer to method threatens to drain its political potential by submitting to regimes of statistical reduction, the reification of identity, the overvaluing of visible behavior, and the foreclosure of the speculative, the counterfactual, and the not yet here that Jose Esteban Munoz designated as queer utopia. By pairing these words together, Matt and I are trying to create a bridge between the systematic and the orderly, which is championed by social scientists, and the interstitial, the chaotic, and the messy, which is prized by queer theorists. One moment, please. I'm trying to advance the slide. Queer methods are possible, despite the seeming incommensurability of the phrase. Yes, the words do conjure a, quote, classic odd couple, uptight methods, attempting to impose order on the slovenly queer, to borrow again from Heather Love, but opposites can attract and sometimes productively so. The baseline for queer methods, as Matt and I imagine it, is first to outline the conditions of queer world making, and second, to clarify but not overdetermine the conditions that make life livable, to borrow a lovely phrase from Judith Butler. This can happen in many ways. I've listed 4 that Matt and I discuss in the introduction to the volume, Imagining Queer Methods. We can think about queer methods as a noun. The idea here is an attempt to create new protocols. One way, a common way of doing this, is to apply the precepts of queer theory, for instance, a rejection of binaries, a rejection of the view that categories of identity are somehow historically unchanging and fixed, to our research practices. We might instead think in terms of queering methods as a verb. Here, what we're trying to do is adjust our existing protocols. There are a couple of different ways of doing this. 2 of the more common ones I've listed for you on the slide. First, we might call subversive ethnographies. The idea here is to study socio-sexual worlds that challenge heteronormativity. One of Matt and my favorites in this tradition is Marlon Bailey's Butch Queens Up in Pumps, which examines the underground ballroom and house community in Chicago. Another approach is called scavenger methods. In this instance, what we're doing is combining existing techniques, often those which are seemingly disparate or somehow at odds with each other, in order to produce a pastiche of knowledge. In the third instance, we might think about queering methodology. So in this phrase, we're pivoting from methods to methodology. And what this means is that we're shifting from thinking about techniques of data collection, for example, interviews, surveys, photographs, archival methods, to the rules or logics that we use to conceptualize our research, so broader, a zooming out, if you will. And finally, there's an instance, a vital expression, actually, of queer pedagogy. And here we think about implications for classrooms, teaching, and learning. At this point, I wonder if it's possible, I'd like to invite Matt to offer a couple of comments here about pedagogy before I proceed with the rest of my presentation. Would you like me to mute at this point while Matt speaks?
Yes, please.
Hi, everybody. I want to start off by thanking Alma and Jordana, Ben, and Say, and just to say to Amin how good it is to see you again and be working with you and collaborating with you again. The fourth approach that Amin just described is the call to think about the relationship between queer methods and queer pedagogy or teaching. And when we think about that relationship, 2 questions emerge that are complementary. First, what are the queer methods that we might teach, where queer methods are the course content? And second, how can we queer the ways we teach methods so that normative pedagogical processes that rely on fixed hierarchies and unidirectional communication are disrupted? In other words, how do we teach queer methods and teach them queerly? There are lots of ways to think about this question, and I'm just going to outline one way. One way is to enact alternative practices of queer knowledge creation, which at CUNY, the City University of New York, we call transformative learning in the humanities. One way to enact those practices is together with our students to engage one's classroom as a non-normative space for method making. This is to say that rather than universalize queer methods content, rather than teach new queer ways of doing as portable and generalizable, we teach them as located work products. Our methods, our queer methods that we can create are located work products. So what are the methods that this class can produce or rework, given these material conditions for pursuing research questions, given our level in this room of access to resources and with our community insights brought to bear at this institution of higher education and with this particularly situated life problem in mind. Then we can think about how far our located queer methods can go. and how close queer methods made elsewhere and otherwise can reach toward us where we are. In this way, queer methods can be the connective tissue that stretches across institutional work sites, not because we all teach and make the same queer methods in the same ways, but because we teach and make queer methods differently across class and race and geographical and gendered locations in academia. And I'll have more to say about that in just a minute, but I'll stop here and send it back to you, Amin.
Thank you, Matt. Now, I don't want this talk to become too academic, which is easy to do given the emergent and complex nature of queer methods and its association with an already complex enterprise that we call queer theory. So what I want to do instead for this particular conversation is to look at some illustrations of these ideas. I'd like to think about three problems that queer methods help me to address as an urban sexuality scholar. First, pertains to data sources. Who is visible and who is concealed by the data that we use? Second, is conceptualization. How do we move beyond binary views of the city as consisting of the gaybourhood, the one and only in town, versus all other undifferentiated, presumably straight spaces? And finally, measurement. How can we detect the presence of distinct urban sexual cultures in a context characterized by greater rates of integration? A big debate in the study of sexuality and space is about the changing significance of urban gay districts, or gaybourhoods, as I call them. Researchers use census data to create an index of dissimilarity, which enables us to make inferences about residential segregation and spatial isolation. This statistic captures the proportion of minority group members who would have to exchange places, usually census tracts, with members of the majority in order to achieve an even residential distribution, which is defined as one in which every neighborhood of the city has the same proportional representation of the minority group that we see in the population overall. Index values range from 0 to 100, where 0 represents total integration and 100 represents conditions of extreme segregation. This table shows that both male and female same-sex partner households have become less sexually segregated from all different sex partner households in the time between the 2000 and 2010 census collections. My book was published in 2014. The paperback came out in 2015, which is why this data ends at 2010. In the US context, the census is collected every 10 years. This data is very powerful. It's one of the few national probability samples that we have, after all, but it's still limited because it only counts couples. It thus underestimates the characteristics of the non-heterosexual population because it's not including those individuals who are not partnered. It's also excluding those individuals who are partnered but do not live with their partner. Similarly, it's excluding individuals who are unwilling to self-identify as gay or lesbian. It's excluding those individuals who self-identify as bisexual, as transgender, as queer, or any other label apart from the one that the census is using in this case. The wisdom here is that we need to diversify our data. Recent innovations in this regard include looking at real estate ads and bar listings. This type of scavenger method increases representation beyond what the census can achieve, as you see here. To establish the second point, which is about resisting geographic binaries, and to introduce a bit of levity into the conversation, I want to first share with you a short 3-minute video.
It's safe, it's very clean. Also, it's very accepting of all lifestyles.
It's a very gay-friendly neighborhood.
Oh, good. That's good. It's good to be accommodating of that.
In an age of increasing cultural acceptance, are gaybourhoods going away?
To answer that question, we should start by defining what a gaybourhood is. These are neighborhoods in cities around the world that have historically been centers for gay people to live, but also of social spaces like clubs, bars, art spaces, anything like that. And they can be gay-owned or not, but they certainly must cater to gay people.
Kid, this is West Hollywood. This is Gay Town. You gotta give the girlies what they want.
A number of examples of this would be New York's West Village or Chelsea neighborhoods, Chicago's Boys Town, DC's DuPont Circle, Madrid's Tueca, Paris's Marais. All of those are traditional gaybourhoods.
The hate and the Castro. That's it. If these are the only people we have to convince, the hippies and the gays, you win.
So your question is, are these places on the way out? The data says they are. A recent study out of the University of British Columbia does confirm that, especially over the past 10 years, the number of gay people who are living in gay enclaves have declined. The percentages are something like 8% for gay men and 13% for lesbians. Some of it has to do with straight people moving in and gentrifying the neighborhoods, but a lot of it has to do too with gay people just not feeling the need to live in such proximity anymore.
Hey, it's our favorite gay neighbors.
As integration has happened, as gay marriage has grown in acceptance and legal success around the country, the need for those sorts of functions has declined.
So, a gay area is better than a gray area?
Oh, yeah.
But is it going away completely? I'm not sure that that's entirely true. Speaking about New York, which obviously I know the most because I live here, instead of being one central neighborhood like Chelsea anymore, it's sort of metastasizing across the map. And I think that's a fine thing, right? It's good to be able to look at the map of your city and see many different places where you're welcome, as opposed to one very small central place. But there will always be places in cities that cater to and really welcome gay people more than others. And that's not going anywhere anytime soon.
We have a couple.
As this video shows, we need to expand our geographic imagination as well as our data. By drawing on an ethnic enclave model, urban studies often assumes that cities have one and only one gay district. You can think in terms of the Castro or the Village in New York, La Marais in Paris, Soho. In my research, I found multiple clusters for specific subgroups of people, like people of color, lesbians, same-sex families with children, and LGBTQ seniors. I call their spatial expressions cultural archipelagos, and they motivated me to broaden my thinking beyond binaries. Incidentally, I much prefer the phrase cultural archipelagos to the imagery of these spaces somehow metastasizing across the city, which is what he said to us in the video. As an example, consider the relationship between gender and the city. Sometimes gay men and lesbians make similar residential choices in 3 instances, as the census shows us: in the Castro, in San Francisco, Provincetown, Massachusetts, and Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. But lesbian geographies are also quite distinct, as you can see on this table. And this happens for many reasons. First, coupled women are more likely to live in rural environments, likely as a result of cultural cues about gender. For example, one rural gay Midwesterner confided to the sociologist Emily Kaziak by saying the following: if you're a flaming gay queen, they're like, oh, you're a freak, I'm scared of you. But if you're a really butch woman and you're working at a factory, it's a little easier. Lesbians who perform masculinity in rural environments are not as stigmatized as effeminate gay men. This makes rural environments safer and more inviting for women. Second, lesbians are more likely to have children, and this creates a different set of housing needs. Gay neighborhoods are more likely to offer single occupancy units at high rents. This steers women to different parts of the same city or to altogether non-urban areas. Third, and related, as a result of the gender wage gap, women have less socioeconomic power. Lesbian geographies are generally located in areas with the lower median price per square foot. And we can see this from the table. If you crunch the numbers and look at averages for the last column on each side, we would see that the number for men is $319 US. The number for women is $293 US. Finally, subcultural differences also matter. Lesbian neighborhoods tend to consist of a cluster of homes located near progressive, though not as flashy businesses like bike shops or theater companies. In fact, lesbians are more likely to plug into existing institutions in a given neighborhood, whereas gay men create new ones in the form of bars, for instance, where they go. This gives lesbian neighborhoods a quasi-underground character, and it makes them seem hidden for those who are not in the know. So in short, sensitivity to queer methodology prevents binary thinking in our research design. One final thought. If the phrase queer culture denotes the ways of life of queer people, and if those ways of life are increasingly merging with the mainstream as societal attitudes liberalize year after year, then how can we detect the presence of distinct urban sexual cultures? In my work, I've proposed two measurement devices: anchor institutions and commemorations. Anchors are organizations such as bookstores or particular bars, community centers, which have a special resonance among queer communities. They are the primary engines of community building, and they locate the material culture of a group of people in a symbolically charged place. One Chicago resident told me, businesses are an important part of anchoring the gay neighborhood and defining it in the same way that ethnic businesses would help define an ethnic neighborhood. Another added, as long as those businesses are still there, that keeps the perception that the area is still gay. Commemorations are a second analytic device that we can use to measure queer spaces. These range from rainbow pylons, street signs, rainbow crosswalks, and blue heritage plaques. In a nationally unprecedented move, the city of Chicago in 1997 used tax-funded dollars to municipally mark its gay neighborhood by installing rainbow pylons along North Halsted Street, which would be Chicago's version of Old Compton Street here. The CEO of Equality Illinois explained why this was a historic decision. With these pylons, we're saying, this is our community space. People move in and out of this neighborhood for different reasons, but the community isn't moving. A local resident agreed with that sentiment. So many struggles are really about contestations of space, he said. When you're allowed to plant your flag, I think it's a victory for queer identity politics because it says, we are here. Together, anchors and commemorations show us how we can use queer theory to rethink the significance of established research practices. In the end, I believe that there's no inherent contradiction between the hermeneutic and the scientific or the social scientific. We, social scientists and humanists, really do the same thing in the end, and that is we generate knowledge. And with that, it's my pleasure now to introduce Matt, who will speak about work on queer methods in the humanities.
Thanks again, Amin. So I think that there's a slide that Amin, you'll put up, is that right? And the slide is what questions are humanities scholars asking about queer methods? So there are four ways I want to talk about those questions. And the first is we're asking discipline-specific questions. If we ask what queer methods questions are humanities scholars asking, we're asking discipline-specific questions, such as how can journalists conduct queer of color interviews within mainstream media outlets? And this is Dr. Stephen Thrasher's question in Imagining Queer Methods. And that question responds, Thrasher is a journalist, that question responds to the impoverishment of straight and white news coverage, especially news coverage of queers and queer news, by articulating a method of interviewing at the margins and by the marginalized. And there are many other discipline-specific queer methods questions being asked by humanities scholars. How to read or reread, how to historicize. In the book, Imagining Queer Methods, Sarah Schulman asks how we think about lesbian history and how we can think about lesbian history without using the word lesbian, when the word lesbian has been renounced. Humanities scholars are asking questions about how to translate, how to value translanguaging, or the use of all linguistic capacities in our queer classrooms. So these questions often remake the methods that we already have names for, reading or interpretation, but they offer queer reinventions of those familiar practices. Humanities scholars are also asking extra-disciplinary questions. For example, number 2 here, how can open access publishing disrupt quote unquote queer knowledge production? Guided by librarians who are leading this charge, we're focused not only on how to pursue a research question using methods, but how to disseminate the findings of our research more queerly, which is to say more perversely. Queer scholars in the humanities and elsewhere are asking along these lines, what is to my mind the meta-methodological question of our time? How open can our knowledge production be? And this raises the question of exactly how messy are our queer methods if those methods produce research that is hidden behind paywalls, right? If it's straightened up in the end by the limited possibility of consumption by a small academic audience rather than curious non-academics or academics at institutions that can't pay for the articles that hide behind paywalls, how queer is the discipline? This leads to another expansive question about queer methods. How can queers share across the academy? How can the field of queer studies draw on its queerly integrated personal and institutional relationships to redistribute resources around the university? And so here you can see that I'm thinking about queer space. The queer space I'm thinking about mostly is the queer academy, the queer university, where we work. I asked this question about sharing because queers are good at changing systems, we've shown that, and also we are everywhere in higher education, though we're differently situated. So we teach in highly stratified tiers, we pursue our research with very different levels of funding that goes a long way in determining the methods we are able to choose. Scholars in the humanities and social sciences are thinking about how to make those institutional differences that are created by class exclusion and economic disparity and racial sorting, not by meritocracy. Again, the university is not stratified by meritocracy. How to turn those institutional differences into queer routes or queer ways for redistributing the resources that we have wherever we are. And here I just want to give a shout out to Chernjit Mann and Yvette Taylor, professors at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, for enriching my thinking here. And I'm happy to say that we have a co-edited collection forthcoming called Queer Sharing in the Marketized University. And finally, I want to ask the 4th question: how is the story of queer methods larger than the narrative of queer scholars' stated commitment to radicality? This is a question raised for us by Professor Heather Love, a literature professor that Amin mentioned. Heather wrote the Mirror Introduction to Imagining Queer Methods and has been at the forefront of thinking about queer methods in the humanities for a long time. In her recent book, Underdogs, Social Deviance and Queer Theory, Love helps us to ask the counterintuitive question: how is the story of queer methods larger than the narrative of queer scholars' stated commitment to radicality? I'm paraphrasing, but I love this question, Love's question, because it helps us to pause and look back as we charge queerly forward, to connect the dots between the largely humanities-based version of queer theory steeped in radical thought on the one hand, and on the other hand, some of the very unqueer social science research methods employed by mid-century scholars, particularly in deviant studies. And here, Love thinks about Irving Goffman in his book on stigma. Love argues that we can't think too long about queer methods as practices that have produced our radical field without confronting methods that are constitutive of that field, but that have been erased from its history. Erased because those methods are normative. Those methods, for example, make claims to objectivity. Those methods had no intention of doing social good or upsetting the social order, but merely describing it. So the final question for queer humanities scholars becomes, this is a difficult question, how can we handle the methodological normativities that have produced and still may produce queer studies? I'll stop there. Amin and I are looking forward to hearing next how architecture scholars are engaging with the idea of queer methods. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Amin and Matt, for an incredibly rich presentation and set of ideas, many of which we've been like unpacking, say Ben and I kind of thinking through how queer and queering kind of play out in various different aspects of our work, but also of the work that we're interested in and that we've been exploring in this series. So thank you. You've given me a lot to think about, and I'm sure the same for others, as we'll hear shortly. To get us started, I guess I wanted to just start with like an open question about what would you each say surprised or enriched you most in the process of editing this book and the learnings that you took from the contributions of other scholars. So anything in particular that surprised you while you were preparing the Queer Methods book?
Matt, if you can hear me, go for it.
Sure. So there's a chapter in Imagining Queer Methods by Petra Dome. And maybe you know Petra Dome's work if you're in urban planning. And Petra also does trans studies, just retired, I believe. And she asks the question, how many trans people are there in the US, right? There are lots of reasons we need the answer to that question to be correct, to be right, not to be queer and mushy and messy, but accurate. And so how do you accurately count? And so this is a question that seems not very queer. Let's get the right number, right? But what Petra does in that chapter, and maybe, I mean, you can talk about more about this, is to say, well, we need to find other ways of counting than, as Amin pointed to, the methods that we already have for counting people. And she goes through a variety of ways to do that, but comes up with, I think the official number of trans people in the US is like 1 million, but Petra gets to 9 million and says the implications of 9 million versus 1 million are huge in terms of actually giving people the public resources that they need. Bathrooms is the best example. Public resources they need to live their lives in a way that is humane and cared for by the public spaces that they're in.
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to take chairs. Like, I have a question that I'd really like to ask. So I'm going to ask one more, and then I'll open up to the online webinar into the room, if that's okay with everyone. So one of the questions that I had, like, I guess one of the things that I really like about thinking through queer methods is the way that it kind of pushes us to like disrupt the way that we see or create space, and to think really critically about what we're measuring and how we're measuring it. And I see so many of the people, this is like a joint event with BSA, but also with the Development Planning Unit, and many of my colleagues and students are here today. And we focus a lot on like thinking through distinctions between the North and South, like development and underdevelopment, Western, non-Western, and like unseating those boundaries. And I've seen this kind of connect taking place there. And I'm wondering, a lot of your work speaks to like Western contexts. And I'm wondering, A, if you've got any broad reflections. I know this isn't exactly where you work, but if you have any reflections on like how thinking through the queering of methods and methodologies with the provocations that you've offered in your book connect with other traditions of like methodological unseating, such as, for example, this kind of move towards potentially like a post-colonial discourse or just more subversive methods. And also if you have any reflections on or can share some examples about any examples of work around kind of queering methods from non-Western contexts. A big question. I'll mute now.
Can I jump in on that one too? Amin, do you mind? I have, this is on my mind because I just taught a queer methods graduate course, and there is a great book called The Good University by Raymond Connell. But Connell is an Australian scholar who has a really big vision of what the university is globally around the world. And the point that Connell makes, so one of the impulses, the queer impulses, I think, that intersects with the decolonial practice and the need to be decolonial in our practices, in our scholarship, one of the ways those intersect is we use the language of decentering Western epistemologies and centering non-Western epistemologies. Connell says, well, okay, yes, we do need to have a facility with non-Western knowledge production. But it has never been the case for people who use methods and create knowledge from those methods, that they have denied or rejected every kind of knowledge system available to them. So the language of decentering or moving something outside, or centering something else, a replacement model, I think is not actually a queer model of knowledge production moving forward, but the question of what epistemologies from wherever we can get our hands on them do we need where we are to fix the problem that we want to fix. And Connell says that itself is a practice that, if you look at non-Western and global South peoples and cultures and thinkers, has been part of their practice for a long time, right? They've never been exclusionary of Western practices, but rather they've always included them within their own knowledge systems.
Thanks, Matt.
Think I have anything there?
No? Okay. Say, Ben, do you have any questions before we open up?
Are you going to speak on the There's actually a question that brings that in, so I wonder whether we should.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. Are you happy for me to read it out? Or Emily, if you'd like to, you can, I think you can unmute if you wanted to ask your question live. Okay, I'll take silence as an okay. I'll read it out. Sorry for the technical mishaps there. Okay. Emily's question is, and statement is, architecture as a discipline could be argued to have its feet firmly invested in real space. In its most simple terms, it's about buildings. As a degree master's or master's program, it's a professional qualification, constrained or enabled by economic, social contexts. But the majority of students aim to eventually build space. How would you apply your ideas of queer methods to architecture in this respect? And how do we queer the profession? How do we queer making buildings? Great question, Emily. Okay. There's a back and forth of who's going to answer this right now. Amin has thrown it back to the room. Ben?
Well, I was hoping someone would address that from the location of architecture as opposed to me speculating.
Does anybody want to?
I can speak out. I'm not sure how weird it's going to come across. I think that's right. I'll do something like
So something, hi, I'm an architect myself. Something that I'm not sure to what extent resonates with queer methods or queer ways of addressing what is that design issue, because I think designers have that same tendency of trying to justify themselves by mimicking the methods of science, thinking there's going to be some sort of a legitimization of their design thinking by mimicking the language of scientists from the hard sciences. In terms of how to queer the way we go about designing buildings or building buildings, I think something that Professor Izaskun Chinchilla at the Bartlett brings up more from a feminist perspective, but also kind of a sustainability, holistic sustainability perspective, is to think about how the way we get taught how to design buildings in architecture school usually starts from big kind of moves, such as the massing of a building, its structure, and then its services, its circulation, like stairs and corridors, and then details and finishes. Whereas if one steps out of the shoes of the designer and steps into the shoes of any user, that hierarchy of elements is not so relevant anymore. And it's also a different hierarchy if you're the user of, say, a hotel as a guest and the user of a hotel as a cleaner. So I often ask my students when they're like put a proposal in front of me to kind of like the hierarchies, change that hierarchy or invert it even, and start designing spaces from the finishes and the details. And that in a way takes you to a completely different result that you would have arrived if you had followed the kind of like scientific, quote unquote scientific method that architecture school tends to teach you. I don't know if this has got any adjacent to querying the way we design buildings or not.
Well, first, I started architecture, but now I'm studying urban design. So just the premise of saying the practice of architecture goes around buildings, I have a problem with that. But more than that, just saying that I feel like about the conversation before of the intersection of decolonization and queering methods, the same can be maybe applied to the practice of architecture, in that saying that when we think of space, usually you think of an imagined user that it's using that space, and that imagined user tends to be the straight male responding to heteropatriarchal social dynamics. So if we think again from the perspective of that imagined user, but we change that imagined user to the new method, to that new data, then you can see that reflected in the way that you design that space, in the proportions of that space, in the dynamics of that space, how in housing, how big the kitchen should be in comparison with the number of rooms, or how large should the circulations be for, I don't know, even like disabled circulations in buildings, or like just the plethora of possibilities extends even more. And sometimes that it's also very intimidating, especially when you have to adapt to certain construction codes. So in that sense, it is daunting, but it is a necessary exercise to keep pushing the practice. And also in that sense, I think it could be even expressed further if we're looking at new construction systems that are being developed in non-Western societies. Like I come from a Peruvian context where we build with many different materials, and that also has a cultural expression to it. I don't know how that intersects right now with queer methods, but I don't negate that it could. And then that's it.
Yeah, I'm a student at the Bartlett as well, and I was thinking about what Matt said about located work problems and the idea of specificity, and like the idea of how design as a process can be specific to, I guess, being queer, also, I guess, queer people who use the space. And in that sense, that different ways of queering architecture is not just like a singular thing. It's a plethora of different methods. And I guess to step back and think about the question of, I guess thinking about architecture as just building, I think is a bit narrow in a sense, and it could be a lot broader than that. I think architecture and yeah, thanks.
You want to go first, or? Okay. Yeah. So I had a very similar question to Jordana about queer knowledge production, especially in like non-Western countries. And I guess I come from like a background where my parents are from like the Indian subcontinent, Pakistan specifically. And my idea, or like the premise I have in my head, is that history tends to like feed into cultural norms around gender and sexuality within the Indian subcontinent, specifically around the idea of like hijra and the third gender in like two specific ways. Like the idea of like how queer people perceive themselves as like in their own like type of gender identity that's not cisnormative, and how that like specifically ties into like the history of like how they've been oppressed and by like colonialism and like British colonialism when the British Empire was in the Indian subcontinent, and also how like they are perceived by like cis people and straight people. My question is in terms of queer studies, I think besides decentering epistemology, which I think the West, like this idea of decentering Western epistemology specifically, and how like we shouldn't go too extreme into like decentering this because it's still part of like people's identity. How does queer studies like develop, what progress has queer studies made in terms of developing methodologies or methods in trying to make observations and findings for these people, especially when states continue to oppress these people and they tend to be marginalized already? I know this is a very dense question, but I was wondering if there was an answer from either Matt or you, Amin. Or, yeah. Like how people with certain specific identities that are fed from like previous British or like previous colonization. So hijra was like the example that I used there, and in the Indian subcontinent, how we make observations and findings for those people, similar to the example of like lesbian geography as like an example of queer methodology and an evolution of queer methodology, especially in the sense that in which like NGOs tend to work with queer people in like non-Western countries to like make sure that they're provided for when the state doesn't.
Do you need this?
So this is maybe I'll jump in and say I don't know the answer to that question. I know that one of the things that happens is that a lot of queer organizing just happens separate from or separate from the state. Right? So the question about how is the state involved? It's often, I think, I'm thinking of a situation in Armenia where feminist bookstores sort of keep popping up and keep getting closed and keep popping up and keep getting closed. And it's just around the fact that education, where the knowledge is being produced, is so at this point in history state controlled that that kind of knowledge can't be produced inside the academy. So that it's produced inside the state. So it's produced outside the walls. The other thing I was thinking about with your question, and this is a slightly different context, I put a name in, I didn't put it in the chat, I'll put it in the chat now. Robert Reed Farr writes a book titled Archives of Flesh, African America, Spain, and Post-Humanist Critique, that I would point us to, that looks at precisely this issue of transnational knowledge production and the ever-present tension and productive tension around Blackness and the colonial project of Spain in South America and Latin America. In English literature, or in literature, we have theorists thinking about the same idea, but in creative form. I'm thinking about John Keane and his short story collection Counter Narratives, which is all about the slavery in South America and the Caribbean, and how knowledge is created in ways that are ephemeral, ways that are magical, and yet ways that are also sometimes quite rigid. He thinks about Du Bois at Harvard, and he thinks about all the many different levels of knowledge production by marginalized people. And so I love that short story collection. And I think we should be thinking through creative literatures as well as through theories, as well as through more formal knowledge products like academic papers and books.
So Matt's response makes me think a couple things in the interest of continuing to create a conversation. As he was addressing your question, he said two things that really stayed with me. First, he's talking about these feminist bookstores which are popping up and then going away and then popping up and going away and then popping up. And then he made a reference to ephemeral forms. So those two comments got me thinking, posing a question in a joint form. First, thus far, what we are asking is a unidirectional question that takes the form of how do we apply queer methods to this topic, right? As you've posted and as others have posted. But in light of Matt's response, and especially his comment about ephemerality, motivates me to want to flip the question. And here, I want to take an opportunity to invite Ben's thoughts. And so what if we ask a different question? Flip the direction and say, based on our study of ephemeral events, let's say nightlife venues in London, what can we contribute to queer methods? So perhaps Ben and Lo, who've been doing this work brilliantly for quite some time, might be able to reverse engineer, based on what you have learned in this context, contributions to the body of work on queer methods.
Read out Alex's question because it relates to.
Yeah.
Hey. Oh.
Can I speak without? Yes. Oh, fabulous. I just wanted to open up in case Emily wanted to come in. Emily, did you want to make a comment in response to some of the discussion prompted by your question?
Yeah, hi, I don't know. Oh, I hope you can hear me okay. Yeah, cool, great. Thanks so much, Amin and Matt. It was a really interesting talk, and thank you to the people in the room. I thought you had some really good responses to my pokey question. Yeah, sorry. It was meant to be that way, I guess. I'm really interested to hear Ben's response as well to Amin's question. So I won't be too long, but I guess I was really interested in that broadness that the last person, obviously architecture is a lot more than just buildings, and I was maybe being a bit facetious, but I'm really interested in that kind of ethics of aesthetics and how this kind of queer method could impact the wider sort of visual of cities. Of course, there's large, big impacts with, you know, pride parades and those kind of ephemeral things, with nightlife and with spaces or with exhibitions that pop up and things. But I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around this kind of broadness of kind of urban design, and actually there's a very clear link that for kind of good urban environment, you need bottom up and you need top down. And I guess in, you know, kind of queer activism, we've learned that we need bottom up and top down as well. So I wonder there's a kind of link there in the two. I'm kind of trying to get my head around that, I guess, because it seems that that's also linked to this kind of idea of that gaybourhoods going away as well, and that, you know, it becomes more mainstream, and maybe mainstreaming queer spaces or mainstreaming kind of queer methods as well is an interesting idea, and maybe in 20 years all academics will be doing this stuff. I don't know, it's kind of interesting that yeah, the gays always have the fashion, don't they, first? I don't know, maybe that's kind of got a link. I don't really know what I'm saying, but Ben, you're much more eloquent than me.
Thanks for that, Emily. I'll pass over to Ben.
I'm not sure if I can come in directly on that, but thank you for the talks. I really enjoyed the talks, and I've got lots of thoughts running around my head, as I'm sure others have as well. I'm not sure they're going to come out as a coherent set of sentences, but one of the things that I'm interested in relation to this question of ephemerality is just thinking about Matt's work on higher education institutions and thinking about this group and the question that we started with, which is how do we build up and sustain some kind of discussions around queer space in the institution. So the question of ephemerality in space, I think, relates to the institutional context as well. And when we're thinking about queer methods, I think the work that Lo and I have done, I think one of the things that we've found is that we have tried to develop these particular kind of bespoke approaches to addressing particular kind of urban questions around nightlife and including ephemeral nightlife spaces. And we have tried to queer our data and those kinds of things. We've sometimes ended up with this kind of queer excess of data then, which we, find we sort of get buried in. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, or whether you have any experience of that from your own research, that I guess it's this kind of balance between wanting bespoke methods, agile methods, to be thinking in complex ways, but then having at some stage to always translate that back, is just something that I think comes up in our research, and it also relates to the question of sort of effort, I think, and work and labor, the labor of queer methods. You made them sound, easier than I think they are sometimes, especially in institutions. And in the context of UCL, one of the things I was thinking about was how does the governance of all of our relationships with each other is very risk averse. The governance of research is very risk averse. So have you had any experience of sort of coming up with those challenges against those kinds of institutional barriers in using queer methods in your institutions? I have some comments about architecture as well, but I don't want to hog the microphone, so I'm going to pass it back to you.
If you can, that's great.
Yeah, so I guess to follow on from what Ben was saying, a question for us is, what is our research demanding of us? As in, what are the populations, the queer communities that we're researching demanding of us? So when we think about things like data collection and demographic data, we've worked in ways that have been using surveys and open data boxes, so we're not forcing people to locate themselves within a category, they locate themselves, right? So for example, we had a survey that had around 250 people respond, and then within that group we had over 30 different expressions of gender that people describe themselves as. And so then that becomes a challenge for us to wrestle with that, but it's really important that we're not erasing people's gender within that context. And so, yeah, our research demands queerness from us, like in our methods. That's kind of part of the challenge. And thinking about, so with nightlife, for example, we've not just been working with venues. It's been really important that we're also thinking about club nights that pop up and disappear, particularly because that's predominantly, those kind of forms of nightlife predominantly serve queer people of colour, trans folks, women at the moment. So actually there's potential for really problematic forms of erasure if we're not attending to those more ephemeral, less mappable forms of nightlife.
Did you, yeah, so Alex, Amir's question in the chat is very relevant to this.
Yeah, and then just because Rita also works on mapping, so I'd like to have this one first and then send it to Rita. Okay, so let's, yeah, Ben, if you can raise the question.
Well, I think Alex has got his hand up, so maybe he wants to.
Hey, I don't know if this is working. I hope it's not creating a technical fiasco.
Do you want to ask your own question?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me? Is it working? I guess so. It's really simple, but my question is, as a geographer, as an urban studies student, obviously we're all obsessed with maps, and it's exactly on this point of ephemerality. So as Lo pointed out, you know, how queer nightlife is kind of moving towards these more fleeting forms of event making and monthly club nights. I'm kind of curious to know how, how geographers can reconcile the urge to map everything. So like mapping queer spaces. And I'm curious to know how we can apply maybe queer or queering something like the cultural infrastructure map, which, you know, its aim is to produce a definitive map of where all queer cultural infrastructure and other related cultural infrastructure is. But yeah, how that sits, how can we reconcile queer and mapping? The two seem a bit incompatible sometimes. And thank you.
The way I would approach that is rethinking my understanding of the map, what the map itself means. So if we do away with the notion of the map as a stable or static thing, then it changes the approach to your question. So I'll answer that or make that more concrete analogically. I can imagine creating a series of maps at different times of day in which, for example, I look at the number of users who happen to log on to Grindr, let's say. And I can create a version of a heat map, let's say, where different areas of the city light up with more or less light, depending on the number of users who happen to be logged on at that particular moment. And then what I would do as a social scientist would look at multiple times of day, different days of the week, different times of the year, and show how the very notion of a map in terms of its use value, in this case, individuals who are logged on, is in itself a fluid, moving protean expression of people's geographic relationships. And I think that that approach lends itself really well for thinking about how we might measure urban spaces. It's one way I would think about it. I imagine that, you know, there may be other people in the audience who would have something to say on this. I mean, for example, you know, Dr. Ducky is with us. And so Ben Walters has done some work on Ducky and may also have, one of the things that might be quite interesting to hear from you, Ben, in your work on Ducky is that you have an episodic event which is located in a venue which is more permanent. And so you have this interesting interaction between the permanent and the episodic in the work that you do. And I wonder how you might approach that.
Yeah, shall I quickly? Sorry, it's bouncing around a little bit, but I do have the mic, so I have the power. Thank you. Again, thank you, Amin, Matt, brilliant presentation, a lot of food for thought. I found it very interesting that to your response of what is queer methods in architecture and urbanism, I'm like, I don't know. And it's definitely something I'm gonna sit with. I'm not an architect, I'm not a planner, but I am obsessed with maps and thinking through queer mapping. And I think what's interesting about queer mapping is that it's both method, but also output. And this is something that I was really thinking about in your presentation about how we've got these ideas of queer theory. This is our thinking. We're then moving into queer methods, queering methods as a type of putting queer theory into practice. But I was left thinking of the sort of the what then? How do we then present this back to the world? And Matt spoke a little bit about this in his section, but for me, the example of mapping that Amir just pointed out to this question, I think what fits really nicely here is this kind of bridging between both methods and output. And I think what's exciting about mapping is that you can take something that, when you initially think of mapping as something quite rigid, very grounded in power and politics and who gets to say what is where and who is where. But when we flip that to think about different ways of representation, of visualizing things, I work through a practice of collaging when it comes to mapping. And I really love that as a way of queering mapping, in the same way that, you know, collaging and queering dislocate, they remove out of context, they trouble, they make things messy. And I really like this idea of, you know, it's a type of locating things in relation to each other, but it's almost illegible. And so I love that. That's very exciting. I'm still doing my PhD. I don't know if that's going to pass, like my PhD to be like, here's a collage. We'll see. But I think these are more sort of thoughts that have been brewing as I've been listening to the conversation. But I'm really excited that we're having this, and I'm really grateful for everybody in the room and online. And so now I'm going to pass to Dr. Ducky. What a title.
Yeah, my name is Ben, or Dr. Ducky, or other things we won't go into now. I mean, I guess the thing that, thank you all so much for this amazing conversation. And I think the thing that's sort of coming to my mind is around sort of utility and instrumentality. And I think on one of Matt's slides, I think it was the idea of, you know, what might unite queer academics or scholars beyond a commitment to radicality. And I think it's really interesting thinking about methodology in terms of intentionality. And what am I trying to say? So I suppose there are times, so it's sort of to do with the civic or the political applications of all of this. And that, so for instance, with the work that Lo and Ben were doing around mapping London queer venues and queer spaces, that, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a certain idea of instrumentality built into how that could be practically functional, sort of useful in terms of interacting with City Hall, the Greater London Authority, and actually trying to mobilize some form of kind of structural engagement around these issues. And so in a case like that, if you might think of that as a kind of queer aim, there might then be reasons possibly to be working, in fact, with less queer methodologies, because you want it to be legible to sort of normative power structures, more or less on their own terms, not to take all of those terms for granted. I was also involved with around Ducky and the Royal Vauxhall Tavern, and basically making that a listed building as a, and that being a kind of a queer aim to secure that municipal protection to stop a building being knocked down in which queer lives can become more livable, to simplify. And so that was a case of making, in some ways, quite a normative argument of, in some ways, using not terribly queer methods to convince historic England and to convince ultimately, you know, a government department to sign off on adding a building to a list of national monuments, which in many ways, I would say, in itself is not necessarily a queer methodology, but it could be the application of a kind of normative methodology for queer aims. And those aims can, in fact, remain unarticulated, methodologically speaking, that you don't, in fact, you don't want to sort of preface a report to historic England by saying, we don't actually take the idea of a list of important buildings terribly seriously. That seems quite restrictive and da, 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 da. But apparently this is what you want to hear. So here are some reasons that you might like. There may be reasons to withhold some of that. Whereas if you're then, I think, sort of trying to generate knowledge within queer contexts, you know, as queer people trying to work and live and talk with queer people, that then I think the idea of queer methodologies and the messiness of that, I think, takes on such value. And just as a final thing, I was thinking about ephemerality and what a kind of subjective and loaded term that is. And why it's very I just thought it's very subjective to think of certain series of events as more ephemeral than kinds of institutionalized activity, simply because the forms of the physical material manifestations of those things may be less apparently stable over time. It doesn't mean that as forms of life they're any less constant or important, maybe. So.
Can we pass it over to Lisa?
Thanks. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's fascinating to be in this forum because it's actually my first time. I guess you were trying to trouble us or mess us up a little bit. And I guess what I stuck with a little bit, what I felt the discomfort with, is the use of data collection as a term. I mean, there was in some slides, and when we were going around, everyone's talking a bit about data collection. And I guess my discomfort comes from, in us embracing this decolonial position, we also are still unintentionally using terminology that precisely is counterproductive, in the sense that if we refer to techniques of data collection, that implies that data is out there to be collected, while actually data comes from that interface between the researcher and the interlocutor, right? So what I wanted to ask is, in this instance, when we're talking about querying methods and so on, how is that relationship different or negotiated between researchers and interlocutor in order for it to become data, not that it's data out there to be collected?
It's really unclear who's troubling who. It's a really provocative question. I feel equally troubled as you were when I was speaking, I suppose. And I think the question really highlights the overlap between where Matt and I work. I think as a social scientist and as a sociologist who does a particular type of work, the way I approach the question is more about the creative ways of constituting evidence, including reflections on what makes something serviceable as evidence, as opposed to what you are saying about the interface between the researcher and the interaction with the thing that we're researching that creates evidence. So I don't know really how to address that beyond, Matt may have something to say about that. But yeah, perhaps Matt will have some examples, because the way I think about it is, if you look at the presentation that I provided, it consisted of interviews, census data. And so for me, it's trying to use tools that typically are cast as being in the normative domain against itself, right? To question some of the hegemony or reach of it, to use it for different purposes. This connects back to Ben's point about intentionality, for example, and what we mean by data. So the example of RVT and getting the building listed, I think, is absolutely queer methods. That falls very much under the second point, which is queering methods, adjusting existing techniques for the purposes of queer outcomes, which is exactly what's happening there. So there are very different ways of thinking about this, but in terms of the way my entry points are ways of working with evidence in order to accomplish non-normative or counter-normative outcomes. But for questioning what evidence itself means, Matt, perhaps you will have something to say on that.
Well, I think when data collection sounds like it is prospective or future oriented. How will I collect the data? I'll make a plan. I'll go as a researcher. I'll go collect it. But a lot of research doesn't actually happen that way. It's reflective, as Amin said. And so we have the evidence of experience. We think back to what has happened to us or who we engaged with when we weren't thinking of ourselves as researchers or as them as subjects, right? And so data doesn't always come from a plan to collect it, but the data is actually sometimes already there in our experience, and the job of the researcher is to unpack it, to distill it, to examine it, go through it. Think of the only reason this is very much on my mind is because this last book I wrote, Poor Queer Studies, I didn't realize that I was writing that book until about 5 years later than I had started writing it. I was having experience teaching queer studies at a very poor school. And I didn't know that I needed to teach queer studies to poor students with very few material resources in a different way. I didn't know that as a research plan. I wasn't saying, find out, Matt, how to do that. I just was doing it already, right? Not as a research plan, but as a way of figuring out how to do the job, almost just not reflectively. And then, but I was paying attention to my students, and I was listening to what they were saying, and I was hearing their stories, and pedagogy was always very important to me. And that gave me a wealth of data to draw on, even though it wasn't, I then didn't have to collect it because it was already there. I had to sort of sort through it and cull it. But I want to say yes and no. Sometimes the idea of data collection bothers me. Sometimes that sounds like there's an impossible negotiation to make between the empowered researcher and the disempowered subject. But I also think that data collection happens in all sorts of ways, because data collection is a corkscrew and the arrow points many ways and multi-directional. And it's not always about this intentionality of using one institutional power to extract data from somebody else, although it can absolutely be that.
Matt's response there makes me think of a particular approach in sociology that would not fall under the premises of queer methods per se, but a conventional method in sociology, and it's called participatory action research. And the notion of participatory action research is precisely what Matt said, and that's to subvert or invert power dynamics in the process of doing research, where the typical assumption is the researcher is singularly empowered to execute a particular research plan. Somehow we know what the right questions are, and our so-called subjects, in quotes, are the ones who are providing data for us, and that they're there almost to be exploited for the researcher's aim. With participatory action research, we don't accept that assumption, and instead, rather than articulating a priori what the objectives of the research are, we ask the individuals with whom we interact to guide us on what the appropriate aims of the research ought to be. And so in this case, the production of knowledge becomes an interactional and negotiated process rather than a singular unidirectional pursuit in which the researcher is the lone source of authority. Challenges that. Marvelous question. Thank you.
So an alternative to the terminology data collection.
Yes.
Would be a good word with that, yeah.
Yeah, knowledge production as an interactional process or negotiated interaction, perhaps.
So just so that everyone knows, we're going to take a last question here.
Yeah.
Ben's got a comment, then I've got a final question to tie the series, and we're done. Okay, is that okay for time for you? Yeah. And for Matt, right?
So yeah, it's actually not like a brand new question. It's referring to the past session one, queer maps. So I'm a student from the Building and Urban Design and Development Masters in the DPU, and we actually went on our practice engagement, which is a week-long thing where we were assigned a topic area, a partner, and we go and we work in a new context. I was assigned queer communities under the themes of identity and livelihoods, and we went to Sheffield and partnered with a community organization called Gut Level, which focused on specifically empower queer communities through club culture. So if you know anything about Sheffield, it's a city with a large history of DIY culture as a response to a city that is largely forgotten, specifically minority groups. So it is very much a response to a lack of care on behalf of the city. So there is a massive focus on resource sharing, transfer of skills, and creating these temporary and easy to access spaces. But this means that a lot of these places are trunted. They're very much on the edges of the city, and they are things that are like very easy to be disrupted through noise complaints, because all of a sudden these things are not valued in certain instances. In trying to map it, what we started with this idea of mapping a sound map of Sheffield to also they have a significant amount of their identity based in music and how that affects queerness and the ability of people to gain some level of space for actualization. The idea that the night can be a safe space. And so we started and we ran like 5 cognitive mappings, and we just realized this problem, like people are so incredibly complex, and that we asked leading questions to try to get certain answers, but we really only got we got things that were really difficult to map. Like I'm here because my friends are here, not because this is a safe space, or I'm here because of the energy. I'm here because I feel safe. And so it changed, and we had to we sort of had to change the way we use sound, and we had to use that instead of just a grounding factor of being a map, but also create a level of relation to the narratives that people actually employ when they access and occupy those spaces. So we created, it's not like fully completed yet, but we have a website that we're making available to the members of that community. And so the idea is that firstly, it gives them a way to become visible in a way that the city has traditionally not allowed them, in that they're classified as noise, whereas accepted sounds are sounds. And so creating those counterpinnings of the sounds of the city, sounds of trams, traffic, construction, and then counterpinning it with the noise and the sounds of the nightlife to visually represent that there are people who are being pushed to occupy spaces outside of the accepted realms of society. And then using that to create, I think, more like traditional senses of like funding outputs, right? This NGO and this community organization would like funding from like the natural lottery, but it's impossible to take what they traditionally do and say, we're affecting this amount of people, we're empowering these amount of people with safe spaces. And so that was our approach to mapping, is that we use sound as a basis and then let people fill it in, put themselves onto the map, and then also that to some degree preserves the integrity of these safe spaces, which I think people are really dependent on, because there are in many contexts so few. And we're talking about people who are a lot of the time people who don't have access to that breadth of safety of space. So that was how we approached this. Thought it was in that topic might be interesting.
Can we also have access to
Yeah, I can show you a link here.
Thank you. Running with the mic. I don't know if those of you who are online heard my little blurb, but we've got a short comment from Ben, one more question, and then we'll be closing. So apologies for running over slightly. Matt, I hope that's okay with you.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in how a lot of the examples are about multiplying different approaches and different types of evidence, as well as like switching as researchers between different contexts. And yeah, I'm interested in something like these kind of maps that build up this kind of excessive narrative, or the example of the listing. I think the listing is a really interesting example, because it was about using a normative structure, but it was also done in a kind of excessive queer way alongside lots of other tactics. So I think this sort of in the urban context, I think coming back to your question about queer methods and urbanism and architecture, I think in architecture, the way it's trained, as we heard from Daniel, is not, it's kind of resistant to any form of queerness. There's still this dominance of this modernist training of that inheritance, which is based on these closed units, and it's about kind of reproducing the studio master's work. And this is something that's very much a live issue in our department at the moment, sadly. But at the same time, I think there is also this kind of drive for bringing LGBT discussions into the built environment practices, and there are lots of new LGBT networks. There is this kind of discussion around queer inclusive design and queer urbanism in practice, which I think does offer an opportunity to think about what do queer methods, how can queer methods be brought in there. I was at a talk this morning, and I won't name the company, but a massive property development company was represented by somebody who instantly started talking about their own queerness, and I thought, oh, that's really interesting. Even like this, one of the biggest developers in London is like being positioned through the lens of queer urbanism. So if there was more time, I'd like to ask you about, the question of how queer methods might also be co-opted in those contexts. That's come up in other discussions around gay space in the past and urban development, gaybourhoods in your work and so on. So there's not really time to talk about that, but Yeah, so I just wanted to say that I do think there are lots of opportunities to think about queer methods in urban practice. But that question of how does that link to professional practices is one that we're still thinking through, I think.
Thank you, Ben. So we have 2 more questions here. I'm just going to make a nod to them because I think some of them might feature in the responses to my final question, Amin and Matt. So Sylvia asked how planning in the built environment can benefit from queer theories. And Lenka asked, how do we avoid generalizing queerness? The question that we've asked all of our panelists over the course of this lecture series is as follows, and we just love any kind of thoughts or reflections that you, Amin, and you, Matt, might have on this. So what would you say for both of you and the research that you do, would it mean to queer urbanism? So what would it mean to queer urbanism, and what would you prioritize within this, and why? And this is our final question, folks, and then we'll be closing off. Okay.
Maybe I'll jump in and just say that with a question, how queer can urban design or architecture be?
Matt,
if it...
what am I now? Sorry, Matt, I was not muted. I am now muted.
Thanks, Jordana. I was just saying maybe I'll answer that with a question, which is how queer can urban design or architecture be if it does not promote interclass contact? So if it does not promote spaces for all, but only spaces for some kind of queers, then you just have to figure out what your definition of queer is, right? So if queer is always implicitly a cross-class term, then your architecture and your space has to invite cross-class relationships and cross-class people, interclass people into that space in order to be queer.
Thanks for that, Matt. I think the only thing I would add, I would do so from the location of a sociologist and a social scientist. And what I would say is that as we think about queering urbanism, it's important for us to keep multiple institutional contexts in mind as well. We briefly flirted with this conversation about ephemerality. Ben, I really like what you said, pushback against the word itself, to suggest that just because an event is episodic and so not continuous in the way that a permanent venue would be, that does not mean that the queer life worlds that space promotes and holds are somehow fleeting or not permanent or not enduring. And that notion, I think, is quite queer, because what it's doing is it's challenging us to rethink the institutional foundations of the city, the institutional foundations of queer world-making practices in ways that necessarily force us to, again, pluralize and diversify the foundations of these world-making practices and the things that we build that make life livable, to come full circle to Butler's quote.
Thank you so much, Matt and Amin. And to everyone who joined us remotely, to all of you that are here in the room. Yeah, I've thoroughly enjoyed today's conversation. I think this is a really beautiful way for us to bring a close to this academic year's kind of series. We will be continuing it, so there'll be more information to follow come sort of September time. Ben, is there anything else that you would like to add? I'd just like to say a massive thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, thank you, Matt, for joining us. I don't know what time it is where you are, but I'm imagining it's early. So really, really grateful for your insights and for so generously sharing your thoughts with us. And for those of you in London or nearby, it's warm outside. So now we will bring this event to a close. If everyone virtually and present could just join me in giving a round of applause to our speakers. And an extra special thank you to Alma, without whom this event would not have been possible. So thank you very much, Alma. Fabulous. Wishing everyone a very nice summer, and until next time, thank you.